welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, that's Shakespeare Girl. From Falstaff being admonished by Henry V and his flame-colored taffeta for being so superfluous to demand the time of the day, as well as the chorus in Romeo and Juliet declaring that this would be the 2 hours traffic of their stage, we can see the concept of time showing up in Shakespeare's plays from his many references to hours and even minutes. But what were the available devices for William Shakespeare to actually be able to tell the time of the day? Those things were very different than the ones we have today, which is why this week we'll be asking the question, did Shakespeare have a clock? This week's episode kicks off the first in a series of 5 that we're going to be doing to explore the history of clocks and clock devices in William Shakespeare's lifetime. This week, we're going to be talking about clock towers, but we're also going to take a look at sundials, wristwatches, hourglasses, and even mechanical clocks. And there's one shaped like a ship that you will not believe. So make sure that you hit subscribe on the channel and don't forget to hit the bell so you'll be notified when the future episodes drop. The next 5 series are going to be amazing. But this week we are taking a look at clock towers, and interestingly, originally the word clock actually meant bell because churches in the various towns would ring their bells to mark the time to pray. And over time, this reference is how people began to tell what part of the day it was. You had morning prayers and afternoon prayers and evening prayers, and the ringing of the bells started out as a way for people to tell what the time of the day was. So townspeople would use the bells as their marker to orient themselves in the time of the day. As these church bells could be heard from very far away, that many people would use the church bells to orchestrate their meetings with other people. For example, you might arrange to meet your friend after the 3rd chiming of the bells. Now, of course, not everybody lived in the same town. So if you and your friend were from different towns and you were planning to meet up, you would identify the name of the town that you were going to go by. This shows up in one of Shakespeare's plays in Henry IV when Falstaff references a long hour in the Shrewsbury clock. By the Shrewsbury clock is the line in the play. Now, in this scene, Falstaff is coming out of a very stressful fight, and so the long hour could mean a double meaning of Falstaff just feeling stressed, but it's also has this double meaning in references to clocks, because notoriously, clocks in early modern England and in Shakespeare's lifetime were notoriously very, very bad. The idea of a clock was new to the world. The first modern clock wasn't invented until the 14th century. So by the time Shakespeare was writing these lines about having a long hour and other lines that show up in his plays that references clocks needing constant repair and just being very inaccurate, that's because clocks had only been around about 100 years at this point, and they just weren't very good yet. They were in their infancy in terms of the development of clocks overall. And so they were considered useful but not reliable for William Shakespeare's lifetime, which is another reason that Falstaff refers to it being a long hour, is because they could tell that it wasn't very accurate. Now, another way town clocks were used to tell the time is by listening to them. Obviously, not everyone who was within the sound distance of the bells could see the clock face at the same time. So when you were using the clock tower to tell what time it was, you weren't always paying attention to the hands moving around the clock face. You were also listening to the chimes. And when it would chime, you would count them out loud, 1, 2, 3, to tell the time. And that's where that phrase of telling the time comes from, is because you are saying out loud, counting the chimes to be able to tell what hour of the day it is. This shows up in Shakespeare's play Cymbeline when Iachimo says 1, 2, 3. He is telling the hours by counting. Interestingly, the idea of partial hours was somewhat of a mixed bag of things. There are references to half hours and even quarter hours, so the concept of a partial hour did exist, but there was no real marking of minutes and certainly not seconds for William Shakespeare's lifetime. As Tiffany Stern points out in her paper, she says, quote, "Only once does Shakespeare write about a period of time made up of accumulated minutes. Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream claims that he will, quote, put a girdle about the earth in 40 minutes. The joke here for Shakespeare is that minutes are an immeasurable amount of time. Only a fairy could use it. You can see examples of clocks measuring hours, which would have been used in Shakespeare's lifetime when you go researching clock towers. And I was really interested to find out whether or not the Shrewsbury clock that Falstaff was referring to was an actual clock. Now, it could have just been purely fictional, and they could have been including it just because when you're doing a play, you've got to do something to mark the passage of time, because you're not actually going to, in Romeo and Juliet's case, you're doing several days of events in a matter of 2 hours. So sometimes the counting of the clock can be used on stage to let the audience know that time has passed fictionally. But Shrewsbury is a real town in England, and it is near enough to London that I thought it might be a real clock. So I went looking into the history of the Shrewsbury clock to see if I could find which clock was the Shrewsbury clock of Henry IV, and I found two places that I think are contenders. The first place is Shrewsbury Abbey. It was there during the time when Shakespeare wrote these lines for Falstaff, so it's possible that's the one it's talking about. From the history of the Abbey itself, it's unclear to me whether it was actually in functional use at that time. It went through what you might call a rough patch after the dissolution of the monasteries, and it didn't really come back to its full development until the 18th century. So it was in a phase of being, rebuilt and rehabilitated. And I can't tell from what I've read so far whether or not the bells would have actually been chiming. The interesting thing about Shrewsbury Abbey, though, is that it is famous for its bells. And so it makes a good contender. I've actually reached out to the Abbey and asked them about this point of history. And if I hear back from them, I'll be sure to let you know what they say about whether or not they think they're the Shrewsbury clock of Henry IV. The second place that I think is a good contender is a place called the Parish of St. Mary's of the Virgin. And it was also there during Shakespeare's lifetime, but it was functional this entire time. Interestingly, it avoided the demolition and damage of the dissolution of the monasteries, as well as the later Civil War, and it kind of just continued to function and operate the whole time. So its continuous operation, it leans me towards thinking it was probably that. Additionally, another piece of evidence that makes me think it might have been St. Mary's as opposed to Shrewsbury Abbey is that St. Mary's is listed as the Market Hall clock. So this was a center for trade and commerce. It would have been a popular place. And when people were telling time in early modern England, they quite often referenced landmarks that people would know far and wide. So like if you and your friend from another town were trying to coordinate the time, you would pick a location that both of you knew about. So the landmark clocks that people would refer to when they were talking about the time were often places that were widely popular. If this was a center of trade and commerce there at St. Mary's, it would make sense that that would be the Shrewsbury clock that Falstaff was referring to. Whether or not either of these places are the Shrewsbury clock, or if Shakespeare is just being completely fictional, we will investigate this. And I am trying to get an interview with Shrewsbury Abbey that will go out on the podcast to see if we can sort out exactly what the Shrewsbury clock of Henry IV is definitively for you. But either way, the fact is that people did use clock towers to tell time, and William Shakespeare would have used clock towers to tell time himself. William Shakespeare had several other devices that he probably would have had access to and used during his life to tell the time. And I hope you'll join us back here every Saturday for the next 5 Saturdays, including this one, to discuss different ways that William Shakespeare would have told time. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and you do have to hit the little bell next to the subscribe button in order to be notified when the new episode comes available, which is really handy if you're following along in courses like this one. As always, there are show notes for today's episode. I put extra bonus history about clocks and clock devices. Every subject that we cover here on YouTube, I provide places for you to go and study further, to learn more, or to go deeper into a topic. So you learn a little bit here on the episode, but if you want to go even further, make sure you check out the show notes. The show notes for today's episode can be found at cassidycash.com/clocktower. That's cassidycash.com/clocktower. You can see the link across the video at the bottom, or you can click the fancy little link I've placed for you in the show notes right below the video, right down there. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.